And with that being said, I will hand it over to Hillary.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for spending a little bit of time with us today. I'm going to share a presentation that I put together, and it is about basically making it uh, more accessible for anybody who's interested in reporting on any kind of litigations happening in the state, um, for you to get the documents or understand what's going on in those litigations. I'm going to be talking about the court systems generally, just to give you an overview of, what happens, how cases make their way through the court systems. And then Rachel's going to follow up with a brief discussion about some great tools for actually getting the source documents from those litigations in the most accessible and easy way to report on them. So throughout it, Andy's going to be looking at the chat and the questions that might arise, and we'll be happy to address those. Andy, feel free to just interject if there's a question on a particular slide. Otherwise, we'll open it up for questions afterwards. But I would love for this to be a discussion and a dialogue, and to also just know what kind of tools we can get to you that would make it easier for you to report on issues that impact your communities or that you find interesting and think people should know about in your roles as reporters and aspiring reporters. So with that, I'll go ahead and share my screen. So I'm one of the lawyers at Southern Coalition for Social Justice with our voting rights team. And so I do a lot of the litigating in the court, but also advocacy outside of the court on various issues related to voting. I work in North Carolina, but also we do a lot of litigation throughout the entire South. And especially we follow trends in voter suppression efforts that happen throughout the South. So while my discussion will be about North Carolina today, our work is certainly not limited to North Carolina. And if it's ever relevant to draw connections between what's happening in state and what are national efforts to restrict voting rights, for example, we're happy to draw those connections and to kind of bring a context to what might be happening in the state. So there's basically two court systems in the United States. There's state courts. These handle matters of state law, constitutional claims. They can also hear some federal legal claims. They generally have a broader jurisdiction, and the vast majority of litigation that happens in the United States, criminal, civil, happens in state courts. And the judges in North Carolina are elected. And that's pretty different from our federal court system, which has a much narrower jurisdiction. You need a very specific federal hook, either a federal legal issue or you have parties that are from different states. So it's not necessarily fair to have it in a state court. That's called diversity jurisdiction. So you need a federal hook. So federal litigation is a lot less common generally. And the judges, of course, are appointed by the United States president and they're confirmed by the Senate. I will say for voting rights litigation, it's about an even split between what happens in state court and what happens in federal courts. And that's mostly because voting-related litigation often implicates federal law. So we'll end up in federal court. So I'll start with federal courts. There's 3 districts. Each of them have their own website, their own way to access documents, their own clerks. And so if you're reporting on an issue or a litigation and you need to call the courthouse or you want to go to the courthouse, just know that there are 3 different jurisdictions in North Carolina: the Western District, the Middle District, and the Eastern District. A lot of litigation for voting specific issues, you'll find will happen either in the Middle District or the Eastern District of North Carolina. But if it's an issue specific to a county in Western North Carolina, that it could happen in the Western District of North Carolina. So some of the major events that will happen at the trial court level include, and I've outlined them here, the complaint. The complaint is something that is filed by the party seeking relief. and it outlines the basis for that relief and what they're actually requesting. So when SCSJ represents parties that file a complaint, you'll get an email from Andy with a press briefing outlining the complaint, maybe linking to that document, with quotes from the clients, the plaintiffs, about why this is being filed, what the relief is that's being requested. So that initiates the lawsuit right there. Within a certain amount of time after the complaint, the defendants can file what's called a motion to dismiss. That means they are asking the court, before any trial, before any evidence, before anything, to just kick the lawsuit out of court and say there's no possibility of plaintiffs winning here. That's very commonly something that is filed, and the court will have to rule on it, either letting the case go forward or dismissing the case. Something else that plaintiffs can ask for, which happens a little bit more rarely, is to ask for preliminary relief. This can be a motion for preliminary injunction or a temporary restraining order. And plaintiffs do this, they're saying, we're going to face irreparable harm unless the court orders the relief we're asking for immediately while the case is pending. We can't wait for trial. Cases can take years to get to trial. We can't wait. We need relief now. So an example of that will be if the legislature enacts a law that could disenfranchise a vast number of eligible voters, plaintiffs could file, a temporary restraining order against that law coming into effect to say, thousands of people will lose their right to vote, and this law is likely unconstitutional. So we need the court to just enter that order right now, stopping the law, so that while this case is pending, the status quo, we are staying with how it is currently. The law doesn't come into effect until the court can determine whether it's actually constitutional. After that initial phase of the complaint being filed and any kind of motions to dismiss, there's a period of discovery where the parties are requesting and exchanging information. So that includes documents, that includes deposition testimony. And technically, unless there's a protective order, these materials are public and might be able to be publicly requested or disclosed. And so you'll hear, you probably can hear about when some big figures are deposed, reporters can report on what happened in those depositions. And that is what happens during the period of discovery. After that can take anywhere from 6 months to 9 months. And then you have what's called summary judgment, where one or both of the parties can ask the court to rule in their favor just based on what was found in discovery. To basically say, look, all of this evidence that we have found in discovery can lead the court to only one conclusion, that we're going to win. And it's impossible for you to find for the other party. It's a very high burden to get a summary judgment ruling. And then if the court denies summary judgment on all or some of the claims, you'll go to trial. And everybody is very familiar with trial. We see that on TV. This is the part of litigation that we see on TV. And there you can have any period from a few days to a few weeks of trial where you're seeing witnesses on the stand and you're seeing the lawyers give oral argument, and a lot of documents can be entered as exhibits during that period. After trial, there can be some briefing, but then the court at some point issues a judgment for one of the parties. So these are the main events that would be events that, especially trial and judgment and summary judgment, might be events that the public might want to know about, and that might be reported in addition to the complaint filing. So after the judgment, any of the parties who does not get what they asked for can usually appeal. And here I have a map of the federal appellate jurisdictions. So there are currently 11 different circuits, and each of those circuits has judges that are appointed again by the president. We in North Carolina are in the Fourth Circuit. And so any appeals will usually go up to the Fourth Circuit. There is a specific type of case that can go straight to the Supreme Court on appeal. And so those are cases that require a 3-judge panel in the first instance. And they can include cases that challenge state laws under certain circumstances. And so those cases can go straight to the Supreme Court, but most cases have to go to one of these federal appellate courts. And at that stage, you have the notice of appeal, then you have a period where the parties exchange legal briefs. And then one of the big events is oral argument. And then, of course, a decision. And usually each one of those steps is public. And then, of course, after the circuit court, any party that still wants to seek relief can seek review by the federal Supreme Court. This is, unless there is a direct right to appeal to the Supreme Court, it has to be via the grant of a writ of certiorari or a cert petition being granted. And thousands of those are filed before the Supreme Court. Very few are ever granted. And for the Supreme Court to want to weigh in on a case, usually it means it has to be a question of first impression of a high public interest, or it has to be a question that those appellate courts that I discussed, the 11 different circuits, have split on. Some have found one way, some have found the other way. And the Supreme Court needs to weigh in order to make the law consistent across the country. The court is actually starting to hear less and less cases than they historically have been. And very few cases out of state Supreme Courts, because state Supreme Court cases can also be appealed in some instances to the Supreme Court. So interesting that they're hearing less and less cases. But at the federal Supreme Court, you have merits briefing. First, you brief whether the court should grant the cert petition at all, whether the case should be heard. But assuming that's granted, then you have merits briefing, which can take, again, about 6 months, 3 to 6 months. And then you have oral argument, which happens in Washington, D.C., and then the decision issues. And usually decisions will issue. Oral argument can be heard anywhere from October to the spring. And then all decisions are usually, they come down by late June. Any questions on the federal court system before I move on to the states? Great. So state courts, are a little bit different. They look different than federal courts. There's actually 2 different trial court levels at state court. There's what's called district courts, which handle lower level criminal violations and, civil cases that are very low amounts of money. There's 41 districts across the state, and those district judges are elected by the voters, and they serve a term of 4 years. And so this is what the districts look like, and you can kind of see generally how they are organized. So Durham is its own district, Wake is its own district, Orange and Chatham County are together. There's also superior courts, which hear higher level criminal issues, so felonies, also civil cases that involve larger amounts of money, and then any challenge to a law that's passed is going to be heard in superior court. They also hear appeals that come from the district courts. So there are 5 divisions of superior court in 48 districts across the state. I don't know why it's not coterminous with the district courts. It seems confusing to me, but that's just how it's set up. And again, the judges are also elected to serve a term of 8 years. And so again, this is what the districts look like, and those solid black lines are the divisions. And actually, superior court judges rotate amongst the divisions. And that was a system that was set up a very long time ago to ensure that there wouldn't be too much regional bias in a Superior Court judge kind of just sitting in the same place. And so the way state appeals work is a little bit more nuanced, but things can go from the district court to the Superior Court to the Court of Appeals. This is from the court website, which I've put at the bottom of the slide. Also administrative decisions generally go to the Superior Court, but you can see in this box here, some of them go right to the Court of Appeals. I don't know why. Just a matter of state law. And then you can, again, petition for the Supreme Court to hear appeals. You'll see one of the areas of appeals by right, so automatic appeals, I had to cross out because that was changed in 2023 under the budget, and the court, I guess, just hasn't updated its website. But that was repealed, and that was very controversial when it was appealed. There's usually 3 judges that hear an appeal at the Court of Appeals level, and if it used to be that if one of them disagreed with the outcome and was outruled by the other 2, that you could automatically have that heard by the North Carolina Supreme Court. They eliminated that. So you have to, again, do a similar to a petition, like in the federal level, you have to do a petition for discretionary review by the state Supreme Court in those cases. And you can also do a petition for direct review from a Superior Court to skip the Court of Appeals. The North Carolina Supreme Court has 7 members right now, including 2 former, very proudly, 2 former associates of Southern Coalition for Social Justice are currently serving on the court. These are partisan offices, technically. They're elected via a partisan ballot. That wasn't always the case. For a short period of time, they were nonpartisan. They were considered nonpartisan, but it switched back. So the partisan composition of the court changes and can switch back and forth quite dramatically. So there was a big switch in 2016 and then another big switch in 2022. And finally, I just wanted to remind folks that there are also administrative bodies, and that the State Board of Elections is the main administrative body that we will appear before. And they have a ton on their website, which I put here. They also have a ton of resources, election data, their meeting minutes, and voter resources. They are the best source of information about voting in North Carolina. There are a lot of other third parties out there. Some are great, some aren't. If you really want to know the facts on the ground of what's going on, the State Board is absolutely the most reliable source for that information. And I will open it up for questions. Ooh, sorry, you stopped sharing here.
Awesome. Thank you, Hillary. As we let people type out their questions if they have any, I'll hand it off over to Rachel to introduce herself and start presenting.
Great. I will share my screen and we'll get started. Alrighty. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Hillary, for that great overview of the court system. And thanks, everyone, for coming. And thank you to the Southern Coalition for Social Justice for having me today. So my name is Rachel. I work at Democracy Docket, and we are a voting rights-centered news organization that reports on all manner of voting rights, redistricting, and election cases. And today I'm going to be focusing on where to source court filings from. And court filings can be very useful as primary sources in reporting, and can oftentimes serve as the impetus for a story. And I will go over where you can locate those as a student journalist or in your future careers as journalists. Okay, so starting off with where to find court filings. So I will be specifically or primarily focusing on Democracy Docket as a resource, which is a free website On our website, which I'll dive into more later, we have over 800 voting rights, redistricting, and election cases. And we are not attorneys, just for everyone's awareness, but we post these lawsuits and any filings we can get access to so that reporters and the public and voters, most importantly, have access to this information and can figure out how lawsuits and court proceedings will affect their voting rights in their specific state. So we track lawsuits from all 50 states. And again, I will delve a little bit more into later in the presentation how to use Democracy Docket as a tool. And secondly, if you're really feeling like diving in yourself into North Carolina court system, you can go on the North Carolina Judicial Branch website, and there's something very handy that I often use called the eCourt portal, where you can search for a case if you know the names of the plaintiffs, so the people filing the case, or if you happen to know the case number. That's a little bit more technical, but I believe the state is trying to have all 100 counties, county courts be on this website eventually. But at least right now I know Wake is on there. That's the one I've used the most, but I know there's quite a few on there right now, so that's also very useful. And then in terms of where Democracy Docket gets its filings, for federal cases, we get them from a service called Pacer, which is an electronic database that has all, or it should have all federal court records dating back to some year on it. At least anything in the past like 10, 15 years I know is on there. But just so folks know, that does cost money. So it can be a little bit inaccessible. I think it's 10 cents per page, which doesn't sound like a lot, but can actually really add up when you're trying to download large sums of court documents. So the idea with Democracy Docket is that our organization is able to get those documents and then post them to the public, so you would not have to get on Pacer. But Pacer is what attorneys use. I'm sure Hillary uses it in her job very often, and that's where the parties who are in cases are posting their court filings throughout a lawsuit. So when you file the complaint, you put it on Pacer, and then every subsequent filing, if it's in federal court, also goes on Pacer. And then for state court documents, those can definitely be a little bit more tricky to find depending on the state. But for North Carolina purposes, as I mentioned, they actually have now one of the more accessible systems. So you can use that eCourt portal I was mentioning before. But again, if you want a little bit more of a simple source for voting rights specific cases, Democracy Docket does get all of those documents in one place. So if there's a state court case, you should be able to find those filings on our website. And then lastly, Hillary mentioned sometimes cases can go up to the US Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court actually does post all of its filings. So there's a way on the US Supreme Court website that Hillary posted. If you go under court dockets, you can search for a case if you know the name of one of the parties, or again, if you know the case number, which can be a little bit more difficult to find sometimes, but luckily you can get US Supreme Court documents and opinions once the court releases opinions, usually starting in June. So it is good that that is publicly accessible. And unlike Pacer, those are actually free. So that is great. Okay, so now we will do a little tour of Democracy Docket's website and just how to use it. So luckily it's pretty simple, but when you open up www.democracydocket.com, the first thing you see is this landing page. And as a reporter, I find that reporters come to our website specifically for cases and looking for case documents. So on the far left up there is the cases tab. And once you click on that, tens and tens of pages will come up with cases across all 50 states. And we have a nice toolbar on the side where you can search by topic. So if you click the drop-down menu, you'll see cases about redistricting, so about cases challenging maps. And there are actually quite a few going on in North Carolina. And you can also filter by state. So that is, of course, very useful. And then finally, we have a case status tab. So that would be whether a case is filed, whether it's appealed, or whether it's decided. And you're able to filter actually all three at once if you're looking for something very specific. Yeah, so I feel like for our purposes, the North Carolina filter is going to be very helpful. And I will go through an example actually of a case page in a second that I think is very relevant. And I will just add, North Carolina is a very active and dynamic state right now. I'm actually tracking a total of 18 open lawsuits there between redistricting and voting rights cases. And ahead of the general election, it's become very active. So there's certainly a lot going on there. But the case I thought would be good just to go over sort of how to navigate a case page was actually a very recent case, which is about digital photo IDs for students who are students and faculty and employees of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So I'll keep it really brief, and if you want more detail, you can actually read the case page. But basically, we have this little case blurb where we essentially summarize what's in the complaint. And then if anything happens in the case thereafter, we also update this case page so voters or members of the public or reporters know what's going on. But I'll try to keep this very succinct. But essentially, in North Carolina, as you may or may not know, there are some very strict photo ID laws for registration and voting. And maybe a month or two ago, the North Carolina State Board of Elections actually approved a digital ID, so an ID that's actually on your mobile device for UNC Chapel Hill. And the Republican National Committee and the State Republican Party actually filed a lawsuit earlier this month arguing that that ID is invalid and that students and faculty need to be using a physical card. So even though, again, the North Carolina State Board approved this mobile ID, the Republican Party says, nope, that's illegal. And they actually had asked a judge in North Carolina to please block that ID. And so far, the trial court judge has said no. The Republicans have since appealed. So all of that information, I know that's a lot, but it's all reflected on the case page. So we try to keep an updated status so you know what's going on. And then I think the more important part for reporters, if they want to really dig into the documents themselves and see what's going on, would be in the case documents section. So a lot of cases we post a ton of documents for, as many as we can. And this case actually is publicly accessible. Let me see what county it was filed in. I think it was, it was in Wake. So I accessed this docket through the North Carolina eCourts portal that I had mentioned. But if you don't want to do that, everything's here. So everything from the complaint, which was the original initiating action in the lawsuit, to responses from the Republicans, and then actually the order from the judge that said, no, we are keeping, or UNC can keep this ID in place. And then the case did get appealed. So we try to separate by court layer. So if you go into appellate court, you can see the Republican plaintiff's petition for appeal, or for writ of super satis, I think it's called. That is a very jargony term, but basically they are appealing the ruling and they want an appeals court to rule in their favor. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, that's pretty much the overview. And if you ever had a question, well, this is on my next slide, so I stopped sharing, meant to go back to my PowerPoint. Bear with me for 1 second. Thank you. Okay, we're back. Okay, so we looked at the case page, but if you're ever confused or trying to find a case, because I know there's a lot of information on these pages, totally feel free to email me. I'm also tracking a ton of lawsuits, so if there's ever a document and you say, hey, Rachel, where is the answer to that complaint? Chances are I might have just not have gotten to uploading it yet, so feel free, and I'm happy to email you the document or just give me a nudge. And I think in the spirit of that, I don't know, what am I? There we go. I was in the spirit of asking others for help or reaching out to reporters. I think that is just a general tip I have, which is do not be afraid to email reporters from local news outlets. People are actually a lot more friendly than you think. They can often be very busy, but they are willing to help if you just tell them, hey, I'm reporting on this issue, or I have a vested interest in it, or just would like to know where you got your information from. Something I have noticed is sometimes outlets won't post documents in their reporting, and that just might be based on their organizational standards or whatever it is, but nonetheless, they'll still be willing to share their source with you. And I think that's good, especially in terms of democracy cases. I think in the spirit of being democratic, we should be trying to share as much of that as possible. And as I said, it can be expensive. So I think sharing that information is just overall really important and for transparency. But yeah, so whether it's me or whether you're reading something from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution or even CNN, I reached out to national reporters at the bigwig outlets. They have responded to me. Another option is reaching out to comms people like Andy, who's wonderful. And comms people also will be willing to, help you out or point you in the right direction. I try not to bother attorneys, but occasionally if you really need to, or you're really digging for something, on the bottom usually of all court documents, there's something called a signature block, and the attorney's emails are usually listed on there. That is like a last resort, because these people are very busy litigating cases, but also recommend going to websites. So say the ACLU files a case, sometimes they'll actually sort of have a version of a case page where they keep the documents updated. So definitely good to try to exhaust all your resources, and just know that we're all in this together and people want to help. So I think that is an important takeaway and just a general tip. I think I have on here. There's also X or Twitter. I still call it Twitter. Don't tell anyone, but I've DM'd reporters as well. So yes, don't be afraid to do that. And I think that's it for me. So if anyone has any questions, super happy to answer. But if not, thank you all again for coming. And I'm really humbled and honored that I got to contribute to this. And thanks for all you're doing with reporting. It's very important, and I hope everyone is feeling grounded this election season, and reach out to me if you have any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. I'll let people type their respective questions, but in the meantime, we did get one question for Hillary that is a little bit more sort of color commentary, but what does it feel like to give an argument in front of the court? How do you prepare?
Oh my goodness. Depends on the court and depends on the time. I like to prepare by reading all of the cases that I've cited, looking at the record, and then we do things called moots, where you practice in front of other lawyers or maybe former judges. And that mooting is so helpful. And you don't have to be a lawyer to moot. If you have any kind of public presentation in any kind of forum, mooting it is absolutely the way to go. Get some constructive feedback and receive that feedback with an open mind and without getting defensive or thinking about your ego, but just concentrating on how can I make the best case for my client in an argument. That's the approach I like to take. Everybody's a little bit different. And I'm always nervous.
You would never be able to tell, though. Everyone go watch a Hillary argument sometime and feel very inspired. Um, I'll hold some space for anyone typing a question still, but in the meantime, I dropped several links in the chat, including SCSJ's YouTube page, where this training will be posted, as well as Democracy Dockets website, the case page for the UNC case in particular. My email is andy@scsj, so feel free to reach out for any questions. Our next and final training of this workshop will feature Caitlin Kaiser from Democracy NC to discuss some topical issues that relate to young people and college students that are sort of part of the conversation of this year's election. So we're very much looking forward to that. I'll hold for one more moment to see if there's any last minute questions. But otherwise, thank you all for joining us for this training on this wonderful Wednesday. To repeat Rachel's comments, hope everyone is staying grounded and healthy and taking care of themselves during this election season. And have a wonderful rest of your day.